Minister for Treasury and Resources.
Richard Bell, Treasurer.
Neil Kelly, Head of Finance Business Partnering for the project.
Okay, great. So we've got 1 hour. Let's see how we get on. If I could start, Minister, with perhaps if you could describe to us what you understand your formal role is in, your formal responsibilities are in terms of the new healthcare facilities programme.
Well, I would say as Treasury Minister, I ultimately have overall responsibility for how the hospital is funded. So where we find the money that we're going to spend on it, how that package is put together, and secondly, how we then, I suppose to some degree, then spend the money. I suppose the actual spending of money is possibly one that's shared with the Health Minister. And I would fulfil that responsibility through the project team, you'll have seen the structure we have in terms of project management and control. I think you've seen the procurement strategies that we have, and also through my officers and specialist advisors in terms of how we borrow, how we draw down the money, and that is all in the context of the wider public finance. So I think it's an overall responsibility.
What structures have you got in place to oversee the spending of money on the project?
Well, I think we've already sent to you we have sent, I've got some in the pack, the kind of project, the project kind of has its own infrastructure, if you like, in terms of the programme, but sorry, I can't even remember those. We've got the senior programme executive group, the senior officer steering group, there's an accountable officer who has to look at that, and then all the various people who are responsible for spend. So that will come up through that tree, if you like, that pyramid of control and responsibility. And there will then be reporting into Treasury and reporting from the Treasury team to me.
I guess what I'm trying to get at is how would you get to know if there was a problem? Would you be asking questions, or would you expect it to be reported to you? I mean, how hands-on are you in terms of interrogating the way that vast budget is being spent?
I think it's very difficult to be hands-on on that because it is so vast and it is so complex. I would expect that to be reported to me. We have very clear through the programme structure, the public finance manual, the programme manuals. I would have every expectation that people will be in line with doing what they've said they're going to do in terms of spend, and that if there is any issue with that spend, suddenly someone realised that they had, and I don't believe this is going to happen, suddenly realised that they had underestimated quite considerably on the cost of bricks, that would be reported to me, because then that would be anything that would create a potential shortfall would then have to come up. So we'd have to look at whether the money comes from another source within the overall pot, or is it significant enough that we would have to address it in terms of the budget as a whole.
I guess what I'm trying to drive at is the separation between Treasury and Health, that Treasury surely has a role to monitor and control what is going on in the spend. And so what questions are you asking to make sure that is happening?
As I say, there is a format I would expect. Do you want to add how that works in practice?
Yes, so there's a number of aspects across various Treasury functions where those functions, in accordance with the Public Finance Manual or underlying manuals, each project and department are required to comply with. So there could be around management of the project, management of the most significant project in Jersey's history, covered within the manual, Public Finances Manual. We have, in addition to which, interface with commercial services, and has been content that how the project is going to be procured is in line with what we expect, and using our services as well. Then we have financial monitoring and control, and Neil is the Treasury finance business partner, so he works for Treasury, but is on the project, and that's another way in which we will receive any heads up. We also have the risk division within our team as well, and that risk the head of risk meets at all the various different levels of that project to understand the risks that the project faces and to look to see if there are risks outside of that as well.
Yeah, and we also have, there is a regular ministerial risk, new healthcare facilities risk group, which meets, I can't remember how frequently it meets, but I am invited to that and I have attended that meeting.
So
And that would certainly, I would hope that that meeting will also, I think that does also look at financial risks, you know, if there's a risk of, in relates to finance, that would certainly come up at that meeting.
I guess at the political level, what I'm interested in is to what extent you would challenge the minister, the health minister, over, let's say, allocations within that huge overall sum of money and say, are you sure that that is the right thing for us to be doing? What evidence are you presenting to me to justify that?
I don't see that as my role. I see the actual build and how the hospital, what it looks like inside, what it looks like on the outside, what it does, how they deliver. That sits with the Minister for Health, and I think the responsibility for staying within budget sits with the Health Minister and the programme structure. We have allocated a certain amount. Treasury cannot possibly go around every department checking whether it's meeting its budgets. I mean, we have accountable officers in every department. They are responsible for staying within their budgets, and they have the responsibility to report if they have any, if they think, and we do see that regularly. You know, we've got the business partners, but the overall responsibility, I think, sits with the Health Minister. And provided they are staying within the budget and delivering within budget, I think it is largely for the programme team to decide, you know, if they decide that a window's in the wrong place, it'd be better over there, you know, and that's going to cost £20 extra, then as long as they find that £20 from elsewhere.
Karen, do you want to?
Okay, I'm just going to jump from some of the questions because it's in relation to what you've just said. But Minister, could you then tell us what the risk appetite of the Treasury is for managing capital projects?
Pretty low. Well, our risk appetite is that where a capital project has a budget, my risk appetite is that they stay within that budget, and I would expect capital projects to be managed within the budget that's allocated to them.
Mm-hmm. But does that mean that you have to put in additional controls in order to make sure that that expenditure is in line with your expectations?
Again, I think if we were talking about a capital project, it's for the department concerned to decide what they are doing and to decide, you know, whether that's building a car park. If they have a budget to build a car park, they have to go and build the car park, and I expect them to stay within that budget. And I don't think it's not within the reporting structures that we've talked about for capital spend and the public finance manual. People have got to stay within the public finance manual. And if people just ignore that and decide to put gold-plated taps, then that is not within the public finance manual.
So usually with any capital project, there is uncertainty or unexpected issues. So what's the tolerance that you're prepared to take in relation to any overspend?
I don't think it's a tolerance. I think people have a budget. We expect them to deliver in that budget. Now, obviously, there will be unexpected issues, and where there are unexpected issues, they have to come and talk to us about it. Because then, if there is a budget shortfall, it then falls onto Treasury to work out whether that budget shortfall can be met. And
so if the request was that there was an extra, let's say, 2% needed on top of the allocated budget, how would you deal with that?
Yeah, that's a bit of a technical question. How do we deal with that, Treasurer?
We've got a traditional saying in Treasury, it's got two letters, but first and foremost, we're looking to see that we've got the right professional advice in respect of contingency in the project, and obviously with a project of this size, contingency is large. We have a history of getting to this stage of the project within government. What we have is a strong government team supplemented by people who have the expertise of delivering this sort of scale of project from elsewhere. So first and foremost, looking to see if the contingencies are where you'd expect from a project at this stage. Secondly, to be clear as to what the scope of the project is, to ensure that the contingency is being used for the purpose that it is there for, rather than for significant changes in scope. That will be in there, and once we get to the stage where the Assembly has approved it, we will look to see whether we need to issue any specific guidance in respect to this project. We have been there in the past, before we've got beyond planning and into having issued a contract. I suppose the next key point in the project from a cost perspective, as well as state's approval and the planning permission, will be when gone out to contract and you have people coming back. That will be the first decision point if there are significant variations from what we might expect going out to contract. That would be the key point. Thereafter, it is largely for the project to manage, and the expectation will be that we do not get to the point of overspend. The pushback from Treasury would be therefore at that point what changes in scope from the scope that is stated can be delivered in order to deliver the savings and therefore stay within budget.
Can I ask?
I just want to understand, Minister, from your view, the Treasurer has articulated that aside any project, there is a scope. And your view very much, it sounds like, is once you've agreed a funding and it's for the Minister to deliver and to deliver within the funding. Are you clear what he is to deliver for the 710 million? Is that scope clear that you feel sufficiently able to be offhand, or do you know what is to be delivered?
Yeah, I think they have plans, they have very clear vision and plans, and I think we're now at REBA stage 2. So we've got a concept design, and that's enabled us to go for planning.
Close to 4 for the.
But it's not just Overdale we're talking about. This is a programme with several different other projects. Are you clear about all of those other projects?
The other projects will be developed alongside. The plan at the moment is to deliver Overdale. That is the key priority, as far as I'm concerned. The key priority of this is to deliver Overdale and to make meaningful progress in developing the other 2 sites. And I personally don't, I'm sure people in the project team do, but this is driven by the new hospital facilities, and I don't recollect having had briefings about the other 2 sites, but the plan is to make meaningful progress on those. So I think that is still in development, and I can't say any more than that.
But there are millions of pounds against those projects within that 710 million, and
they're in the minority. They're not huge sums of money in the great scheme of things, I don't believe.
Sorry, Minister, you mentioned that the Minister for Health had to work within the allocated budget. Now, obviously, you are new Treasury Minister, so you came into office with that budget already allocated. What efforts have you done to review that allocation, and are you satisfied that it's appropriate and needed?
I don't have the skill set to review that budget. That is a very, very complex piece of work. The budget hasn't changed. The budget, I believe, was 710 last year. It's 710 still. That is what we're expecting to deliver Overdale and make meaningful progress on the other 2 sites. In terms of how I sat down with reams and reams of bits numbers, no, because I couldn't tell you whether it's right or wrong. That's why we have the project team. That's why we have Treasury officials. But we will be taking the whole, you've seen the structure of decision making. We will be taking everybody's making very strong efforts to make sure this comes within budget.
It's okay, thank you. In the Green Book, it states that the OBC should be calculated according to international account statistical framework. Can you clarify which frameworks have been used by Treasury to set out the financial costs in the outline business case?
Do you want to explain this? I could just read this out.
Well, I will explain it by reading it out. In respect of the Green Book that we refer to, we're referring to a UK document issued by HM Treasury. We adhere to the principles regarding the Green Book, but the Green Book is a UK document, and the what's it
That's
called?
why we're asking about what we're using.
Well, so we
International National Account Statistical Framework, so we...
So that's broadly about the fact that UK is a far more complex and broader organisation than Jersey, so it uses these categorisations of cost in order to capture where they might impact departments. We don't adopt that in Jersey, so we use what we would generally expect to see in any business case, costs broken down against the costs that you would see in the project. And I know that the panel has seen the business case. That's broadly in line with what we would expect to see in a business case. Those costs look to be appropriate in terms of their categorisation.
How do you benchmark that? How do you know?
How do I know? By the fact that the team has consultants in place who are experts in respect of this, that challenge in respect of the project when putting those together. But those, as opposed to cost categorisation or accounting categorisation, if I might suggest in respect of the Office for National Statistics, we're talking about building the costs up using professionals in their field, experienced in building hospitals. Then there are checks and balances within the team reporting upwards to the programme director and the accountable officer.
So those consultants would use frameworks?
Well, they'd use those frameworks if they were building something in the UK. We're using broadly categories of cost appropriate to this project.
So we don't have any standard framework that we're using, we're just adopting the principles of the Green Book?
This is about categorisation of costs. The costs, when you look through the business case, are the categories you'd expect to see,
Okay.
rather than dogged adherence to whether it's capital or revenue, for example.
Yeah.
We're more interested in the overall cost, be it revenue or capital. We are interested in the ongoing revenue costs, but they're split out separately, as opposed to splits between revenue and capital and how they might feature in the Office of National Statistics from the UK.
Okay. So in terms of the monitoring that you undertake for the programme, can you just talk to us about how, as a Treasury Department, you review that expenditure? I know we've heard from the Minister about an explanation as to what the governance framework is, but if we're adopting principles and if the decision-making is dispersed somewhat through the programme, what specifically is it that Treasury and the Exchequer do to review the expenditure separate to the project team?
Firstly, we're embedded within. There are finance representatives from Treasury within it. Neil being one. Secondly, we will have regular meetings, as I said earlier, across the different functions within Treasury that contribute to the control of the of this particular programme and the NHF1 part of that programme in particular. That will be adherence against frameworks that are in place through the Public Finances Manual. We will be then, just as we are with a department, and in particular departments of particular size, looking to see where the variations against the budgets that have been set in detail are, and looking for the explanations against them, and then also looking to see where the forecast is going and whether we will have questions as we
Are there any
always
areas
do.
that you've got particular concerns about? Firstly, I look that we're confident that we've got the right level of contingency within the budget. There are a number of risks to this project, and the one in particular, well, the one that's across all versions of the project is getting the project to the next stage and get it delivered.
Political risk.
I didn't use the word. There are more than just the political risks, but they are part of it, and they're rightly there. Secondly, is can we get a good feel of people interested in the project, and that comes with some of the past history of the project. But so engagement with suppliers, whether that, and that particularly the large contractors who could deliver this project. I think that's where I'm looking for that next milestone in the project to ensure that it can be delivered within budget. So that's really, from my perspective, where I see the next large risk to be. Of course, there's planning permission and state's approval, but that's the one that's going to give us insight as to whether the budget is adequate.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you.
Constable,
Yeah.
would you like to?
Thank you. Minister, could you please describe how Treasury and Exchequer ensures that the level of funding requested for the programme is appropriate for the expenditure required?
Level of funding appropriate for the expenditure. Well, the funding, I would have thought, has to match the expenditure. If they are forecasting a budget of 710, and we have to, our job is to make sure that we have 710 million available to meet that spend.
Yeah, I think the point is, Minister, they've said to you and the Exchequer, we want 710 million for this hospital. But has that been checked, fact-checked? Has your department had a look at the whole situation and said, actually, that's probably about right? Or do you think with a forecast later on with inflation and wage inflation, etc., that might be overtaken, or that might be dropped a little because you've got sufficient, more than sufficient contingency? Has the Treasury actually checked their figures as opposed to being given an ask?
It's a very complex project, and we do have to rely on the expert advice we have. The construction cost, it's been developed with the design team and cost consultants. We've got cost consultants, quantity surveyors who are expert in the field, and the 710 also takes into account the cost of construction and inflation, and it's got optimism bias, and it's got risk contingency. So I think we are satisfied with all the work that has been done on this by all the experts, that is right. But
Satisfied. And it has
we have to rely on professional advice for that, because none of us are going to be able to would know how much hospital costs to build.
But you do have people in your department who can cost measure.
Yes, as well, we don't have cost consultants, no, but we have people who have been, as Treasurer just said. Do you want to touch on that again?
Well, so the approach to date, in particular in this project, which is not necessarily the approach with all projects, but usually is with the larger projects, is that there is representation from within the Treasury on the project. And that allows us insight and therefore to be embedded in the project so that we're receiving the reports, or representatives from Treasury are receiving the reports, and we can form a view through
So you're
that
satisfied
work.
that the figures are right? Okay. Can you provide your assessment of the extent to which the outlined business case provides sufficient information and the level of detail required to determine whether the programme funding and expenditure is appropriate? This crosses over the previous question to a certain extent.
Yeah, so it's at outline business case level. I think at this point, ahead of back to the point I'm making about going out to market, it's got it's probably got more detail in it, or it goes further than previous versions of the business case for previous versions of this project. So at the level you'd expect at this stage in the project, then yes.
There is a big query on this as far as going out to tender with a project figure, total project figure, before you've had tenders in. So what you're expecting is anybody that's tendering will say, yes, we can do that for 710 million, but that hasn't been tested yet.
But no, because we're going out to tender in the near future.
So at the moment, we don't know whether somebody will be able to produce the project at 710 million.
Well, there will not be, there will be multiple suppliers, I would imagine. There will be a main delivery partner.
Yes.
But they will not have a budget of 710 million, because we have, for good reason, that budget is made up of various elements.
Yes, I'm aware.
And the actual budget for the build will not be 710 million, it's much less than that. So that's why we go out to tender.
Do you have a parcel of money for the main contractor?
We
So
have what, sorry?
a parcel of money for the main contractor.
Yeah, so once we have that, the business case spectrum, if you like, will move us to the final business case, which has more detail fed into it through the knowledge that we'd have as we'd gone to market. That may lead to other decisions needing to be made within the budget. That might be about scope. But first and foremost, for all projects at this particular level, we're looking for state's approval of the budget to move to the next stage. That's consistent with other projects.
Thank you,
I want to move on with some questions from the Deputy IO.
Of course. To move on to the different projects in the overall programme, Overdale, Kensington Place and St Saviour's. Please can you advise how Treasury ensures that the funding for each specific project within the programme is appropriate?
Richard?
Is that a repeat of?
I think
Drilling
that's
down,
the same.
drilling down into, we want to understand the extent to which you've interrogated the non-Overdale parts of this programme, which are significant expenditures in their own right.
Not in the great scheme of things, I don't think.
Well,
They would be the second largest capital project in the government's programme on their own.
So we will, it's broadly outlined in both the budget, but further detail within the business case as to what that relates to. It largely is taking those plans to a, Royal Institute of, I've lost my baby.
REBA.
Yes, REBA, stage 2 for those plans, but also having recognised the need to make some progress on the existing site. Again, we're embedded within that programme. The scope of that work is not where the focus has been to date for the project. It's been on the Overdale acute, but the budgets are set within the business case. The reason we don't say what those budgets are is that will therefore remove any commercial tension for anyone bidding for the other pieces of work. You can either say that's how much money we've got allocated for that particular job, or you can say that's the total, now tell us all the other bits and we'll get to that answer.
Can I just ask a question on that? Why is that any different to the fact that you've identified £710 million for the hospital development?
How is it?
Why is it different?
They will be different. I would envisage they are going to be different contracts, not in this particular tender process. So you know what the total of the project is. In the past, one of the, it's a trade-off between absolute full transparency. That transparency is absolutely right for the political process, but what that means is that puts government at a commercial, and therefore the taxpayer, at a commercial disadvantage. It all being in one means that there's no clear, therefore, amount that we're thinking of, including the level of contingency, as there would be in the past, that might be, therefore, what a bidder bids for, even if they could do it less expensively than that.
Can you outline the financial risks and benefits of a phased approach to the hospital facilities programme?
Well, I'd love to focus firstly on the benefits. So the phased approach really is about deliverability. I mean, this is by far away the largest, and I'm talking about NHF1 capital project or programme in the island's history. NHF2 and NHF3 are in there, would possibly be in their own right significant projects of a similar potentially of a similar scale. We are far more advanced in respect of NHF1. So affordability of future phases comes into play as well, and how we're going to finance those. That's a key element from a Treasury perspective, is being clear that these are distinct pieces of work, distinct from one another, so that we could therefore be clear that we can afford those particular phases as they come forward. That's a large element of that. There is also deliverability, given the scale of it. If you were progressing NHF1, NHF2 and NHF3 at the same time, well, you'd have to wait until all that was developed. That would be quite a challenge from a deliverability perspective. My language, not a technician's language, in terms of the economic impacts for it in particular, but also how you get the workforce in place to deliver those projects, both from within government and outside of government, and also the governance oversight have been on top of all of those projects at the same time.
And also, I'd
Sorry.
say the kind of political element, I don't think anybody is in any doubt that we need a new hospital, that the hospital we have is no longer up to current standards. We need a new hospital, and I think if we do not deliver a new hospital, the public will really be well, we know that I think the public want to see a new hospital, they want to see a new hospital pretty quickly, so that is why the focus has to be on the new acute hospital, is it acute? I hate those expressions. The new hospital Overdale, the public are saying get on and build that, and that is what we are trying to do, and the others will follow, but
We're
that
all on-
has to be the priority.
What work did you do as Minister to investigate the Kensington Place and St Saviour's elements of the outline business case, which obviously involved tens of millions of pounds? And what evidence was presented to support the need for spending on both these projects?
I'm quite interested, Minister, in your answer to this. I mean, this is about political oversight of millions of pounds of taxpayers' money. So I'd like to know what your understanding of those additional elements within the OBC is.
My understanding is that those elements are relatively minor in the overall framework. And yes, they are millions of pounds, but in the context of £710 million, they are a relatively small amount. I have not investigated because it is not within my skill set. I could look at the business case till I'm blue in the face and I would not be able to tell you whether it's right or wrong because that is not my area of expertise. So there's an element where you have to rely on design teams and the planners and all the financial specialists and all the financial controls to do that. But we have as far as I'm concerned, we have a relatively small amount of money in the 710 to do development work on those two other sites.
But do you know what those sites are for? What is going to be built there?
No, well, I know what I'm not, well, sorry, I do. Kensington Place is going to be the ambulatory, and I've got reminded every time what ambulatory and acute means. Kensington Place is going to be ambulatory, which is outpatient, so that will be a better version of what we've got at the moment in town, and we've got the health village at St Saviour's, which will focus on mental health, but I don't know the exact detail of what that involves. So that is the overall thrust of what we're trying to get to.
I guess a thrust is quite high level, but you know,
Well,
within
that's my word. I'm sure people on the team have a much clearer idea.
but within the funding, it must be for a quantum of development that responds to healthcare needs. And you know, we've just touched on the risk, positives and benefits of phasing, but as a phase, this is intended, as our understanding, to be able to work standalone. So it's really, you know, how much have you looked at whether even, not whether the beds are the right brand or whether they provide, but the quantum and form of what meaningful progress on these two sites would deliver, and whether you as Treasury Minister, who's financial controller there, is seeing that as an appropriate
But those will
spend.
be different projects. Those will be ultimately separate projects and will have to be funded as standalone projects in due course. The meaningful progress is to allow them to take forward the planning, to develop what that may be, and once they have those plans, once Overdale is complete and is well on to completion, because what we don't want is not to complete Overdale because everybody's too busy working on other sites, as the Treasurer says. There will be work involved, and that really is in the hands of the experts, and I'm in no position to judge whether that's right or not.
So, Minister, you've already said that the allocation to Kensington Place and St Saviour's is very minimal, as you've said.
In the context of 710 million,
exactly.
it is a relatively small
And you have
amount.
also accepted that the Health Minister will be coming back to you for substantial sums to proceed with the Kensington Place project, although that is supposed to be running concurrently. So when do you expect that to happen, and how much do you expect it to be?
I don't know, because what I said there, I think the meaningful progress on those two projects will include what they're going to be and how much they're going to cost, and they will come forward in due course for funding, and we will have to consider how those are funded. But at the moment, the main development work is on Overdale. and those other two sites will follow. I don't have a timescale. I think that's a matter for those are questions for the Health Minister.
But we
I-
can expect substantial amounts to be required for the procedure of the Kensington Place site.
It depends on how those are structured and what they're going to do and what the scope is. Now, I haven't seen a scope or a specification. I don't know what the scope or specification is. That is part of the, I am assuming that is part, my understanding is that is part of the meaningful progress work in terms of scoping out what those two things will comprise. And then there will have to be a future discussion of what the cost is, and the states will have to decide whether it wants to. It's not just my decision, because this will have to come to the Assembly in terms of what it costs. Is that what we want? Are we satisfied? Can it be done another way? So I do think those two sites are absolutely a discussion for another day.
So is it?
And we know they will cost more money. Yes, they're not going to cost what we've got. We're not going to build Overdale and those two other sites for 710 million.
So is it your understanding that the meaningful progress on these two sites is preliminary and design work, or do you see within phase one a spade in the ground, so to speak, on sites outside of Overdale?
That's not my understanding. Meaningful progress is what I've been led to believe, which I believe will be some initial work in terms of what we want to do, what the need is, what the scope is, what the concept is.
But not
I
footings and...
There may be spades in the ground in Kensington Place. I don't know. That's a matter for the project team.
Can I just ask you in terms of, you talked about low risk appetite before, but what you've just outlined is that there are significant risks associated with the way in which the development is shaping up and the money and the flow of that money is being organised. So can you tell us what kind of assurances you're going to establish or secure that gives you the confidence that what you're actually committing to in terms of capital spend is going to be able to deliver the outcome that's anticipated through the strategic outline case?
I don't think I have said there are risks. I've said that they will be working on what 2 and 3 are going to look like. As far as our main focus as an Assembly has to be building Overdale. And I think that's what everybody needs to be focusing on. And we know that there will be additional costs that are for a future date. And whether those facilities are ultimately built will depend on whether the Assembly supports the funding, and we can produce the funding to do them. But Overdale seems to be very clearly the thing that we have to deliver first.
I think there's no question about the building of the hospital. What we're trying to establish is whether or not, in terms of the assurances that you're seeking as a Treasury department, that they are aligned to the delivery of the strategic outline case. And whilst you've got the content and the detail of what is certain in the sense that we need a hospital, what we're trying to do is what kind of certainties do you have at this stage about the other phases of the programme?
So, some of the funding within here is to develop the concept plans, REBA Stage 2 technically, for those other elements of the programme. So that's the sort of money funding that you would put in place, as we have done for up to this point, for the building at Overdale. So that work needs to be progressed in order to understand what the costs and the options for delivery of those two sites are. The difference between Kensington Place and what is the plan for a future health village at St Saviour is that, of course, you're going to be moving services out of Kensington Place and leaving other services in place. That necessitates a degree of work to be done on that site in the meantime, which use of the site on the street that escapes me that we took from Kensington Place. So that's the difference between the two. What we've been making clear to this point, we'll do so again, is that any works that takes place there is not the sort of works that says, I've built 4 walls, now you need to give me the money to build a roof. It is standalone and discrete pieces of work that are not that are not dependent upon any further funding on the site. So this, it shouldn't be that any works that are done on this site almost tie your hands to do further work. It should be for the meanwhile use of that site, because that site is currently has currently services within it which will be moved up to Urberdale. So that's how I regard that meanwhile use development work on that site, so that it's a place that is appropriate for hospital services to be delivered. And there are services, the walk-in, ambulatory, outpatients, one of those headings to be applied to it. So that's what that spend relates to, rather than forcing the hand of government or forcing the hand of the States Assembly to the next phase. The next phase would be subject to its own business case.
But you are forcing the hand, at least implicitly in this, because with developing a St Saviour's site, have you interrogated whether better value for money might be provided by using the very large estate that we already have, for example, at Gloucester Street and Kensington Place?
I think the design team will have done that. You know, that's part of a whole. That is part of a health vision, and it's for the health minister and his team to explain and divide that vision. The vision for the provision of healthcare doesn't sit with me.
The value for money, of whether it's value for money, surely does sit with you.
But we've been talking about the multi-site approach for 2 years now, and it has been broadly accepted by the Assembly. From what I can see, we have accepted that approach, and there will be implications arising from that, but that is the approach we have accepted as an Assembly. We have been talking about it for 2 years, and delivery of healthcare and its cost, and I think there's an element of crystal ball gazing here that in terms of future work.
You would be happy for some of the money within the 710 million to be spent on, say, buying fields in St Saviour, which aren't zoned for use, effectively tying the hands of future decision making around the location of facilities?
I'm not sure if it envisages buying fields, but if a field was bought, any field that's bought can be sold, or it can be applied for another purpose.
It can be, but so that, I mean, we have only, you know, the information available to us, but the feasibility study that was made public showed the plans for the high-level plans for a health village on what is agricultural land. So how would you feel, you know, to the chair's point, to buy agricultural land? Would you want to see it bought at an agricultural value, for example? Because there's an element of speculation that comes in here, and you say land can be bought and it can be sold. But, you know, from an accounting perspective, would you feel comfortable buying over agricultural price if ultimately it has no zoning, no kind of planning backing to be used for anything other than agriculture?
I don't know the answer to that question. You know, I think if, again, this comes down to the overall health strategy and what the design and development team think they can do with a field. And if they buy a field at a price, I would certainly expect them to buy it at a price that reflects its use and its likely use.
Okay, thank you. Minister, the proposed budget highlights some of the key challenges to the sustainability of public finances in relation to the programme. Can you provide an overview of how the Treasury and the Exchequer are managing the risks associated with the specific programme challenges, particularly over the time of the project?
So if you're driving at the cost of the project as opposed to the financing of the project?
It's actually both, because there have been issues around how and in what way the project is going to be financed. So if you could illustrate the two, Richard, that would be helpful for the public to understand.
I'll focus predominantly on the financing, because I think we're going to end up giving similar answers to what I've done on the project itself and the monitoring that needs to be in place. Adequate contingency, for example. We have had a model for funding of the hospital which recognises, like previous versions, which recognises the scale of the project, unprecedented scale of the project through any of those previous versions as well, and also therefore recognises that it isn't possible to achieve the level of funding required for the project through the means that we might have otherwise done in the past. It's not 45 million for Kennebear School, it's a very large number. So we've always looked to include either entire debt or blended approach across other sources, which has from time to time including drawdowns from the strategic reserve, for example. There are, and of course the FPP report of, was it only last week, does underline the importance of retaining the strategic reserve and ideally growing the strategic reserve in terms of the resilience of public finances, but also the second part, its importance in terms of us being able to borrow in the market at a good rate, in particular, or borrowing full stop in the market. So we've always had an approach that at its heart includes borrowing. The things that have changed since previous versions have been the cost of that borrowing. At different points in time, it would have been possible to have borrowed cheaper, but the project is now at that point again where we can we can look to access markets, but it's at a higher interest rate. That brought with it an additional threat, as well as actually over the last two phases, the last two versions of the project, the scale of the cost. It just is our experience of COVID using revolving credit facilities gives us the flexibility to be able to access borrowing without locking in at those high costs and looking to see when the market might stabilise and therefore be able to borrow at favourable rates. But nevertheless, the previous model where we were looking to use strategic reserve returns in order to fund the interest costs appeared to us to be more challenging, and therefore we were looking for other ways in which we could fund the interest cost. The interest cost now, our proposal is that it's top sliced out of the base case, the prudent, that's the word used by the FPP estimate of what we might expect from Pillar 2 from 2026 onwards, and that forms the first slice, if you like, of that funding in order to meet the interest costs. That means that the interest costs are not going to be met by increased taxation or savings from elsewhere, or what would have been quite a strain and threat to the long-term value of the strategic reserve. So there's broadly the issues that have changed from previous versions. We've also had an eye to potential costs arising from NHF2, NHF3, but also that we know that I think there's probably a need to start looking at other means of funding other capital expenditure across the island. The FPP points to the pressures placed in a low tax regime on capital programme given the revenue costs of departments, and therefore we haven't proposed in this particular iteration to borrow the entire cost of NHF1, knowing that we'd like to retain some borrowing capacity. Therefore, the default position, we do anticipate, if not in the forecasts, higher receipts to come from Pillar 2 tax regime, and that those be allocated firstly to meeting the other costs. The default position, though, that we have to put in place, given that the states needs a default position for certainty, would be drawdowns from the strategic reserve for the remaining balance.
Okay, thank you. That's really clear. There's just one follow-up question, if I might.
Yep.
And is that approach going to be adopted for the programme until its end point, or are you going to take that approach in relation to each of the different phases? So we might actually, if I were to ask you a question about the same question around phase 2 or phase 3, you might have some variation to that approach, or do you anticipate this being the approach all the way through the programme?
Well, I think from a perspective of subject to where we see Pillar 2 receipts, and there'll be a number of calls upon those Pillar 2 excess receipts if they are large. And that's why we've not built them into the base case. I'd expect us to have to consider other means of funding outside of just tax receipts. However, just as with this particular version of the hospital, the funding strategy has changed, and I expect it to change with changing circumstances. So I'm not going to throw that dart in that bud at this side and say, hold me to that in 3 years' time, or 2 years' time, or 4 years' time. I'm sure it will change depending upon the state of the public finances, and that's also part of the decision making here in phasing it, to be clear what the state of public finances is as and when decisions are made further down the line.
I think we have to probably move on and try and keep quite quick now. But looking at the project, and you've mentioned contingencies, could you describe, Minister, the contingencies that have been identified and built into the financial case for the programme?
Well, I can't describe them, no, but I would imagine they would. Well, they cover there's a general contingency for increase. We've got inflation, optimism bias, and contingency. I don't think we should be discussing those publicly because of commercial sensitivities. But again, we have expert advisors who will be looking at areas where contingency, and it will be contingency to give us a cushion in terms of cost being more than we expected, or
Are you satisfied they're appropriate? The levels
I
currently
believe so.
forecast and planned?
I believe so.
Okay.
We have to rely on experts, I think.
They're
to tell us
appropriate
that
to a project
contingency.
of this type at this
Yeah.
stage. in-
Okay.
Yeah.
And then looking at some of the kind of the political lead here, of course, following the change of government earlier this year, the ministerial lead changed from infrastructure to health and social services. From your perspective, I wondered if you could explain the rationale behind that move.
I wasn't involved in that decision, but it makes sense that the health minister has a very close involvement in the building of the hospital, which I'll say no more.
And with your kind of financial controlling hat on, do you see in particular any financial risks or value for money risks associated with the fact that the chief officer for this project remains the chief officer of infrastructure and environment, whilst coming from a different department's political lead, if we are to understand the chief officer correctly?
I don't think so. No, I mean the chief officer has had whoever the chief officer ultimately reports to, his or her obligations under the public finance manuals are not changed in the programme manuals. Their obligations and responsibilities are unchanged in terms of the way they spend public money.
The issue about the minister being the health minister taking charge of the project is he's both the client and the supplier in a way. So he's the person who ultimately decides what goes in the hospital. He's also the supplier of the building. Is that an appropriate way to run the project?
I don't think it's right to say he's the supplier. He is the client, and he's instructing the build he wants. And I think it probably makes sense for the health minister to have a very close involvement with the building of the hospital.
The accountable officer is the health minister.
No, the accountable officer is the health chief
Chief
executive.
executive.
Chief executive,
Chief
sorry.
officer.
The chief executive is the accountable officer,
Yeah.
not
The health, whatever the title is for the health chief officer, rather than in my head, the accountable officer
Chris
for health
Brown.
is the accountable ultimate accountable officer for this project.
Is Chris.
That is now Tom Walker. The accountable officer for infrastructure is the senior or responsible officer for the delivery of the project. But ultimate accountability officer level is with HCS.
I've got a question returning to this question of the multiple projects within the programme. Is it conceivable that money could be moved from projects such as Kensington Place or St Saviour to fund the main Overdale Hospital? And if so, would there be any oversight in that?
It's conceivable in terms of a single head of expenditure. I think the approach we'll probably take in terms of the public finances manual is to require some additional decision making outside of the project to move monies between the separate.
It's quite an important point, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because it's a way, a sort of backhand way in which you could increase in which the costs of the Overdale project could be increased.
The overall funding for this project is to deliver a number of deliverables that are established, and therefore, when you are moving some from one to another, you're inevitably altering the scope. So we'll look to put in place under the Public Finances Manual some additional control around that would therefore involve Treasury Minister.
Would the logical way of doing that not be to create separate heads of expenditure for the different projects, Minister?
Well, that would therefore reveal and remove the commercial tension that we're trying to achieve by keeping it in one
It would
head
still
of
leave quite a
expenditure.
bit of commercial tension because you're only removing a relatively small part of the budget.
This is true, but
As
if
the
you
Minister
are expert in delivery of these projects and you know the narrow scope of it, you might be able to, as we are, arrive at a reasonable estimate of the level of contingency that we are carrying. We know what the total envelope for the delivery of that project is.
Can I just come back to the point around the accountability issues here? So in terms of delivery, what you've just explained is that the accountable officer is the chief officer for health for the delivery of the project.
For the overall project.
For the overall project. What do you understand about what those accountabilities are?
So
Does that include delivering financial
that includes
reports?
financial accountable officer has become to mean a great deal more things than it was originally intended, which is around responsibility for economy, efficiency and effectiveness and regularity. And the key one in regularity is not spending money you don't have.
Yeah, we're just
Not
trying to
spending it on
understand
things you shouldn't be spending it on.
we're just trying to understand where, you Minister as financial controller overall, who actually manages the financial risks of the project and the programme?
So there is a governance structure that includes a political steering group.
Yes,
There
we
are
know,
decisions that
and you've
rest
told us,
with
but
that.
who is it?
So ultimately, the accountable officer is responsible for staying within the budget. The only two ways that the budget can be added to for an accountable officer, and this applies across the piece, is through the Treasury and Resources Minister or the States Assembly. The Treasury and Resources Minister, particularly these days, is constrained whatever funds are available elsewhere.
So which accountable officer is it?
The ultimate accountable officer is the Chief Officer for Health.
Okay. Could I just, one more thing, and I'm obviously running up on time, was about this tension. I just want to understand what learnings you're taking from this programme to the wider responsibilities of the Treasury Minister. You've mentioned that if you keep more money within one head of expenditure, it in essence gives you a greater commercial tension. So are you considering applying this to wider areas outside the health estate, for example, youth facilities or other capital programmes to in essence hide any one part of the build, or do you see this as a model to copy across
it
Treasury
already-
and Executive?
In essence, it already is. There are quite large heads of expenditure, which we call history back in the day, the ruling head of expenditure
Yes.
for infrastructure. That's not one project.
No.
There's a
But
number
there
of
are
projects.
several projects which are discrete projects. Have you considered consolidating any of those as to take this as a model example?
Shall we just say that in particular in respect of this project is a particular risk given the size of the project.
Okay.
That it's a balance between transparency
Okay.
and ultimate transparency is really important to us in Treasury as it is across departments, but we have also seen as we've gone through different versions of this project in particular, it puts it as a commercial disadvantage. And when we look elsewhere, it's not as publicly available what that contract sum is going, the allocation for that particular contract is for those who would be bidding for the work.
I think we're going to have to end it there. That's an hour. Races by when you're having fun, doesn't it? Thanks very much indeed, ministerial team, for coming. Very much appreciate your time. And we will now move to the States, I think, as the next forum where this is. And there are some questions that we didn't manage to get to answer in
Move to
this.
the States.
Very
What do you mean, sorry?
well, debating the budget.
Oh, the budget, yes, sorry.
I think we're still planning to do that. Now, there are some questions which we didn't manage to get the
course.
time to answer, so you can answer them at your leisure.